So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for booking an hour and a half today to learn a little bit about economic resilience planning. My name's Andrea Wilkey. I think I've met many of you, but there's a few names and faces that are new to me. So my role is I'm the Executive Director at Community Future Central Kootenay, and part of our mandate is to support communities in our region to be economically healthy. So watching the trend of natural disasters over the last couple of years and seeing the experience of some of our colleagues, we've identified that this is an area that we want to try to work with our communities to support communities to not only have emergency management plans in place, but also to be thinking about economic resilience and setting ourselves up for recovery. So the purpose of today is to give everybody a really good background on what economic resilience planning is, to set the stage for when we come together for face-to-face workshops. And we're going to be doing those in Castlegar, November 25th, Slocan Village, December 2nd, and then in Nelson on December the 3rd, which I'm looking forward to. Before we go any further, I also just want to mention that this project's made possible by a few different funding sources. So one is funding through the province of BC, that is rural dividend funding that was allocated to Selkirk College, which they have then allocated to the purpose of helping our communities get economic resilience plans in place. So thanks to those individuals. And we're also working closely in partnership with the Village of Slocan Valley Economic Development, and we've connected, I believe we're going to have on the call the volunteer fire chief, John Gates from Slocan Village, which is great. From Castlegar, we're working with the City of Castlegar Economic Development, Castlegar District Chamber of Commerce, and also in touch with the fire chief, Sam, and the deputy fire chief, Nick from Castlegar. And then in Nelson, we've been working with David McAllister, the emergency manager, as well as Len, and Chris Johnson with the RDCK with emergency management. So the work we're doing is definitely meant to complement existing emergency management plans, and really look at it from an economic development perspective. So to kick us off, I'm very happy to introduce Jeremy Stone. He's been our educator on this for almost a year now. And so the presentation Jeremy is going to walk you through is going to explore the fundamentals of economic resilience for small and medium-sized communities, and coping with risks from fires, floods, major employer closures, and related hazards. Jeremy is the Director of Community Economic Development at Simon Fraser Universities and specializes in economic recoveries after disasters. So Jeremy's going to pull up his screen, and can I ask all of you that don't have your microphones on mute if you could mute them now? And if you have a question that comes on during the presentation, feel free to type it into the chat box. So right now I can see Kelvin and Tammy and Andrea. If you could mute your phones, that would be great. And Jeremy, I'll pass it over to you.
All right,
Andrea. Yeah.
I'm on the Zoom with video, but I don't have any microphone on there, so I'm actually on phone and,
okay.
And on the screen.
Okay, sounds good. We're not hearing any feedback, so we should be okay.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, everything's okay? Okay. So, you know, I just want to say that I feel kind of excited, as maybe as nerdy as it sounds. You know, a year ago, this fall, I presented to the Economic Development Practitioners Network dialogue in the Kootenays, and we were able to, you know, like have these initial conversations about, well, you know, what is economic resilience and what does it look like? And you know, I think compared to anywhere else in the province, the Kootenays really responded. They, you know, Andrea and others, you know, really said, oh my gosh, this is something that's important and something that we want to talk about more. And so over the past year, we've been collaborating on various, you know, various conferences and whatnot to further spread this message throughout the region. And, you know, various communities have been very interested and supportive of this. And so it feels really great to be able to now work on plans for communities. You know, I have to say that this is really cutting edge stuff. You know, not many communities in North America are doing this kind of planning and doing this kind of community engagement. So, you know, I just want to thank all of you for sort of believing in this and following, you know, Andrea and others sort of visionary approach to this, and I'm excited to do the work in the coming weeks and months. So with all that, I'll go ahead and put up the presentation for today. Some of you have probably seen this before, but if you haven't, well, hopefully it's good. But this is the culmination of a lot of work that I've been doing over the past, about 15 plus years now. This is just some background on me in the program. Simon Fraser Community Economic Development has been around for 30 years. We're very much focused on community engagement, working with communities to create solutions and provide them with support from the ground up. We're located in the faculty of environment, so we're not only just looking at economic issues, but we're also looking at environmental issues, social issues, cultural issues, and trying to find those quadruple bottom lines for different challenges for economies. And I myself have been working in the field for about 18 years, started working in small business, like a small business organizing in Washington, D.C., and then it just took off from there. I've done lending, microfinance, various forms of economic development since then. And then starting in around 2004, started really getting more and more involved in economic recoveries. Worked a little bit in the 9/11 recovery in Lower Manhattan, then went to New Orleans and did hurricane recovery. And it's just gone on various disasters ever since. Usually I tell people, if you see me coming to town, it's a really bad thing. You don't want to see me there because something's usually gone wrong. But I'm finally turning the corner of my career where hopefully we're actually doing preparation and mitigation of those things. And so seeing me is hopefully a happier moment for some people. So, I just want to start out by providing the context. I mean, and this is really the context, is that, we're at a point in whether it's, like climate change or the larger, the changes that are happening environmentally across Canada, that there are more and more fires and more floods. And so, especially in the Kootenay region, we're, seeing, larger events happen, more impactful disasters. Grand Forks, I think, is a really great example of something that just we wouldn't have foreseen 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And now things like that are happening with more regularity around the province. And so, trying to get ahead of this and be prepared is important. And we've been doing this from a community perspective, but not as much focus has been put on the preparation for economic disruption. After the fires in the Thompson and the Thompson Rivers region, there was some research done that showed that, for the businesses, it wasn't just the actual fire damage that impacted them. A lot of it came from just the interruption due to loss of utilities, a loss of customers coming to the region, loss of inroads into the region, transportation, etc. And I think that that's really the scary part of this for most local economies. It's not that you even have to have your downtown flooded or destroyed. It's that, if there was something happening in your region, if there is something that knocks off your major utilities or your transportation, then your business community can have a serious downturn. And I think that a lot of communities only look at sort of the flood maps and sort of the risk assessments. They don't realize that there are a lot of other impacts that can really be felt in their communities. The other side of this that they found after the fires in the regional district was that 8.5% of businesses held business interruption insurance and were able to make a claim. That's a really, really small number. And I think that what's important to note about that number is that just because you have insurance for business interruption doesn't mean you're necessarily able to make a claim. Not every business has the capacity to make a claim. Not every business has the right set of circumstances that are impacting them that will allow them to make that claim. And so we have a lot of situations where either businesses don't have the right insurance across the board, or if they do have the right insurance, there's something that happens in the adjustment process when you have claims adjusters come out where they don't get the money or they only get a portion of the money. And then a last thing here, which I think is actually an amazing number. I sometimes question this number, but they found that 61% of businesses did not have a business continuity plan, meaning that 39% did. That's incredible if that's true, because in most situations we find that 5% might have business continuity plans, and those are generally the larger businesses and corporations. You usually see that with major corporations that just have these policies, and they have risk management departments that are already going through and making sure that their affiliates have these business continuity plans, but many just do not, especially on the small business level. Many businesses don't have these plans. And so, I think all of this is just meant to say that there is a lot of risk for business interruption. And it's not just on the level of, well, does every business have a business continuity plan, but are we prepared across the board? Looking at utilities disruption, looking at actual physical destruction in our downtown cores, et cetera. Are we prepared for some of these disruptions? Another aspect of this is what happens to the labor force. And I had the opportunity to work on the Hurricane Harvey recovery. I'm originally from Brazoria County, Texas, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's down here on the coast of Texas. And that whole region was hit pretty hard by that hurricane. And when I was working that recovery, we would get these displacement maps every day from FEMA. And it was just remarkable how far evacuees went. Many people would relocate with distant family. And the thing that I always say about this, we saw a similar disbursement after the Fort Mac fires. People evacuated and would go into BC, other parts of Alberta, across the prairies, even, into Ontario and elsewhere. And the thing, I always ask, well, is how do we get these people back home? What will incentivize them to get home and return to our economy and return to their jobs? And the fact is that a lot of our disasters happen in summers. And once, September 1st comes around, people start putting in their students into local schools wherever they're at. And once you start getting students, like kids into schools in, far away places, people are much less likely to come home. So, there's two parts of this that we're really concerned about. Well, where do all of our employees go? Are they able to come back to work in a very quick and timely manner? But then also, what are we doing to actually get them back home, to incentivize them to come back? How can we get going quickly again to bring them home? Because if we don't, then those people never come back. And we've seen even, after Fort Mac, that when they reopened the city, not everybody came back. They still haven't resumed the same population levels that they had as before the fire. So why do we care about economic resilience? I think I've hinted at some reasons, but there are some principles to me that I think are important. These are important not just from a perspective of, well, this is what happens to the economy and this is why you should care, but I think this is also about communication. When you're talking to taxpayers, to residents of your communities, what are the things that should be important to them and that you're communicating about? Like, why are we doing this planning and why are we investing in these preparation and mitigation activities? The first thing is, well, here they all come. Sorry, but the first thing is the business provide critical life needs. Whenever you go out each day, you're usually meeting most of your needs from businesses, not from the government, not from other entities. Your food, your medicine, clothing, whoever built your house, all of these are usually in the private sector. And so when an economic disruption happens, whether it's disaster or closure of major employers and smaller businesses start closing, you start losing those critical life needs. And so having a good plan for economic resilience, make sure that as soon as possible, you get those needs back. Someone is requesting remote control of my content. But then also businesses are beacons of recovery. So some businesses, so like when you have an evacuation, you often have, everyone leave town, and then a few people will come back when you've reopened the area. And those people will be, a cousin or an aunt or an uncle, and they're going to go back into town and just check how things are and let the family know what's going on. When they come to town, if there's no grocery store and no daycare or, no major employer, then they're going to go back and tell the family, hey, we can't go home yet, because even though maybe our home is available, we can't meet our critical life needs. We can't, go about our daily business. So oftentimes people will wait to see those businesses come back, those critical businesses, so that then they choose to come home. And it sort of feeds on itself. If we're not getting the businesses open quick enough, we're not getting people back home, and then other businesses can't open because they're still waiting for that staff to come back. And so, it's very important to get businesses open as soon as possible, communicate out, to the staffing communities as well as the buying communities that, hey, we're open for business, we're ready to go. And then businesses provide, the basics for individual recoveries. We have, a need in these communities to get access to lumber and to nails and hammers. Usually people will need, some sort of facility to maybe live in, like they need to get a trailer or they need to get storage. There's all kinds of needs for the individual recoveries themselves that rely on the private sector. And so being able to bring businesses back online quickly not only allows those recoveries to take place, but it also channels back all of those purchases that are made for individual recoveries back into the community. If people are having to leave and drive to a Home Depot or somewhere far away, then that money stays far away and it doesn't get recirculated into your economy. And then finally, local businesses are accountable. One thing that we often see after disasters is that we have a great deal of fraud, contractor fraud. You'll have a ton of vans come into town from different areas, and they're full of people who might have good intentions, maybe not. They're doing work and then they leave town. Definitely in other recoveries, we've seen that some people have said, hey, I'll fix your roof for $10,000. If you give me $2,000 up front, I'll go and get all the materials and I'll come back and start working on it. And then they take that $2,000 and you never hear from them again. Similarly, people will do the work and they'll replace the roof, but then it starts leaking in 6 months and they're gone. But if you have local businesses doing that work, then those people are generally accountable. They're not going to be as likely to commit fraud. If they do shoddy work, they're nearby. They're easily, grabbed and said, hey, you've done bad work, and they are held accountable. It's important to have those protections in place, and they usually come through local businesses that are known, that are registered locally, and are accountable to local people. Sorry, this is so much text, but there are lots of other impacts beyond just hazards themselves. And it is important to think that it's not just that you had a building that's gotten flooded, that you actually have lots of other possible impacts that we have to be prepared for. The first is indirect effects like brand damage or customer loss. The brand damage to communities is significant. We saw during the fires a couple years ago that tourism communities throughout the province were getting impacted even though they didn't have any fire or smoke. But just because the region had sort of a brand, a particular, story about them that, oh my gosh, this area is on fire, then people stopped taking their RVs there, they stopped going for their summer vacations there, and then other unimpacted communities were feeling the downturn. Similarly with customer losses, your building itself, your business might not be impacted, but because the loss of customers to the community, then you experience a downturn. Capital leakage is another problem because oftentimes you have these outside companies coming in, or you have providers of services that are not located in the community. Then that money goes out. And when that money goes out, the business owners who are in town, the employees who are in town are not making that money, and they're not spending it locally. And so, being able to stop that leakage is really important. But just being very aware from the outset that, if you don't get on this, your businesses will continue to suffer in the long term. Substitution effects, consumers shop very differently. We find that when basically, people are focused on some very immediate needs after a disaster. They're worried about, rebuilding, they're worried about food, some really core parts of their personal well-being. They're not thinking about, we just had a flood, I need to go buy diamond rings, or I need to go buy video games, or I need to buy toys. There are a lot of businesses that are not as important to the spending needs of people immediately after a disaster. And so those are impacts that we have to consider for the long term. How do those businesses survive? And then at the same time, because people are moving out of the community and new people are moving in, there's a lot of businesses that have a shifting customer base. They might have lost their customers, and are now the new ones don't feel any connection to shopping there. And so being able to understand those long-term economic effects are important. The same thing happens with supply chains. People, some companies that are buying from a certain supplier, if that supplier is in an impact zone, they might change who they're buying from. And then once they get a new relationship, they aren't necessarily going to come back. So being able to support your business to businesses is very important to enable them to keep going the long term and keep their relationships. Volunteer drain is something I always try to highlight for people, because even though volunteers are very important, and being able to deploy them to the neediest members of the community is important for recovery, those volunteers are also replacing sales by private sector businesses. So, if you have a ton of volunteers that you're inviting into the community to gut houses, those are house guttings that are not happening by your contractors. They're not happening by your labor. They're not getting paid for those services. And so being very thoughtful and methodical about how volunteers are used is important, because you can undercut local businesses. I often make the example too of, how you deploy food and water in cities. We've had conversations in my work before with, in the States with FEMA about, well, where are you doing water drops? Because a lot of times they'll do the water and MRE drops in large parking lots, but large parking lots are usually found where there are food stores and stores that sell water and other supplies. And it suddenly becomes a direct competition to those stores. And so not to say that people shouldn't have food and water freely accessible, that's not the point at all, but how do we deploy these things while we're supporting the economy, but also meeting people's needs? Role of subsidies is another thing to consider, just in the sense that there's often a recovery boom that happens. So a lot of money will flood in after a disaster, targeted at things like hotels, restaurants, other similar businesses that are participating in the recovery and supporting that sector of people who are coming in. Bars always do really well after disasters. Recovery workers, when they knock off, they want to go get a beer. That's great, but then that just keeps an artificial boom for some businesses, so that after about a year or year and a half, 2 years, when the recovery slows down or stops, then they just start feeling the impacts of the disaster. Then they're feeling the impacts of a shifting customer base, et cetera. And usually by then, a lot of the supports for businesses are gone. So we need to consider, like, how long do these effects last for, and like which businesses are going to be impacted at different times, because not every business is impacted in the week or month following a disaster. And this leads to a final point of just dead businesses walking. This is a term that was coined around the notion that some businesses, because the market has changed, because consumers are shopping differently, they don't know that they're going to go out of business yet. And maybe the market change for them is going to really hit in 6 months or a year. And in the meantime, they're investing tons of savings, all their insurance payments, et cetera, to keep this business afloat. And then once they've gone through all those resources, they eventually go out of business. And so, another aspect of economic recovery and resilience is thinking about, well, what are the retirement options? What are the wind down options? Like, how are we providing that support to enable businesses to gracefully exit the market and retain as many resources as possible? How do we work with some of those businesses to actually pivot and change their business so that instead of doing what they've done for 10 or 15 years, they're actually, creating a new business that has a better market fit now? Or how are we actually utilizing this as an opportunity to invest in new business, support entrepreneurship, et cetera, so that vacant storefronts are being filled not by an older business that might, just fail anyway within the next, 12 to 24 months, but a new business that's going to take on the new vitality of the downtown core and create a new generation of opportunities. There's a couple of myths that this leads me to, and that I think are important to discuss, because a lot of what we've been talking about so far is like, well, how are we supporting businesses? How are we focusing on businesses that are being impacted? And a lot of times when I speak to government, they say, hey, that's not our job. Businesses take care of themselves. Businesses make money, they make profit, they've got resources, and we just don't deal with that. This is a photo from a business that I worked with after Katrina. It had been flooded. They lost a ton of inventory. They were, a marginal income business, like it was a lifestyle business. They had this convenience store. They had been there for 20 years. They were an older couple. They just didn't have a lot of resources beyond this business. And they were also limited in English proficiency. They didn't have really any idea how to navigate a bureaucracy, going through the claims process, et cetera. And the fact is that many, many small businesses especially are like this. They are just doing well enough to make it day to day, sell their goods and services, and pay their employees. They don't necessarily have any extra money or any extra capacity to deal with major catastrophes. And so, if we care about having our basic needs met by businesses, and we care about having our communities be, places that can employ people, then we have to consider, well, how do we get involved? How do we support, these businesses in returning? And, what I'll get back to later in the conversation is just, that we don't have to do all this alone. This is a whole community effort.
Jeremy, if I can jump in, we just got a question on the last slide. Could you give an example of a dead business walking?
Well, I think, a good one is like the toy store. Where they get flooded out and they take all of their money. They've got some savings, they put it back in, they get back going quickly again. And then when they reopen, it's say like the 3-month mark, because they did have those resources, people are not yet ready to buy toys. And so then that means that they're not making money, even though they've invested a lot, maybe taken out a loan. And so then they eventually go out at the 6 or 9 month mark, because they're not even able to service their debt, much less pay their rent. Another aspect of that is that, maybe they were a toy store and there were a lot of families before, but because 20% of the families with children had relocated because they got their kids into schools and other communities, then they're not buying toys anymore. And so the business wasn't prepared for that loss of their local market, and they were only making marginal profitability, paying themselves their salaries as it was. And so because of that market change with people moving out, they didn't even know that they were facing a potential downturn. They thought, if I just rebuild, it's going to go back to normal. Okay. And I think that leads us to our second myth that I think is also important, is just this notion of bouncing back. Do we ever bounce back? You know, the word resilience means to bounce back. And I think whenever we deal with major, you know, disaster situations, we say, hey, we've got to get back to normal. We've got to get back to the way it was. And the problem is that you can never really bounce back. When you have something like this photo where you have a large flooding situation or a large fire situation, it's never going to be exactly the way it was. Things are going to change. You know, the built environment's going to change. Your demographics are going to change. The needs and desires of local people are going to change. And so we have to be prepared to actually bounce forward, to actually look into the future and say, okay, well, where do we want this community to be? And so much of disaster resilience and recovery is so focused on getting back to something that we do create more dead businesses walking. We, you know, create lots of situations where people are trying to go back to the old thing in a new environment. And it's not only, you know, bad for them, but it does a disservice to the whole community, because we're not also thinking about how can we plan for the future? How can we pivot? How can we invest into new opportunities? And so trying to find some balance between those two, I think, is important. So what are we planning for? Like, what are we really talking about here? And I think that, you know, these are three of the big ones. You know, one is that we want to bring back the critical services that the private sector provides. So we've got to plan for that. We have to think about, well, what are those critical services? You know, who are the important grocers, the important businesses that serve both our basic daily needs, but then also our cultural and social needs? You know, what's the bar or the barber shop or whatever that you know is very important to us and that maintains our identity as a community, and how do we make sure that they're able to come back too? The second thing is supporting the many businesses who, like people, cannot recover alone. You know, we are really good at supporting individuals with their recovery needs, you know, providing them with housing, providing them with supports, financial and otherwise, but we're really bad at that when it comes to businesses. And then finally, you know, rebuilding into a new and uncertain economic future. Recovery has to be forward focused as much as it's focused in the past. We need to support businesses, but we also have to take this as an opportunity to pivot and move forward. So when, you know, we talk about this at SFU, we try to talk about it in terms of community economic resilience. You know, something that's not just economic focused, but it's also community focused. And so part of that is putting, you know, well-being and livelihoods at the center of this planning. You know, it's not just about bringing businesses back, but it's about bringing their importance to the community and the services they provide and the goods they provide back. But it's also about being inclusive and holistic. It's not just about major employers, but it's also about, you know, how like people are managing their home-based businesses, you know, how those are impacted. Like there's an entire spectrum of economic activity that goes on, and they're important for lots of people, because people are not just running the big storefronts, they're also running, you know, small income enhancing operations from their homes or in other industrial locations sometimes. And how are we focusing on them as well, because those are important. And then finally, just spreading responsibility across the whole community. This will be a constant theme, but, you know, how are we making sure that everyone is involved? So I'm just going to go quickly through some examples of things that I think are relevant, some case studies from other places. After the Christchurch earthquake, we saw that there was a cordon around the city, around the downtown, which was, you know, there were lots of damaged buildings down there, but the city basically closed off all entrance to those areas. But that's where lots of the businesses were located. And the inadvertent impact was that a lot of those businesses could not get restarted for a long time. And so what they did eventually was to come up with this container mall idea, where outside of the cordon zone, they created a space where there were lots of containers, they painted them, they allowed businesses to go in and establish themselves in there. And it brought some economic vitality back to the community, but then it also allowed these businesses to have some space. And this is something that we can do and plan for ahead of time. You know, we can think about, well, how can we create these spaces for businesses to locate if, say, the downtown is compromised for a long period of time? We shouldn't have to wait for like 9 months after the event and realize, oh gosh, it looks like, we shut down the economy because we shut down the downtown. This is something we can do ahead of time. The New Orleans Office of Workforce Development, one of the great things about them is that, they're dealing with a lot of people who have barriers, who are on public assistance. And so whenever they have job fairs, they also ask people, well, are you available to work after a disaster? And they keep a list with people's contact information, especially, next of kin contact information, where they might evacuate to. And then when a disaster happens, the most vulnerable parts of the workforce are contacted immediately, and they're deployed, so that if the Park Service calls and says, hey, we need 20 people to remove debris, or they have a business call and says, hey, I need 3 or 4 people to come over and help me, gut my place or, rebuild, they have access to that labor immediately, and it connects those who are most likely to be out of work with the most urgent needs. We'll come back to this when we talk about community futures and talk to Deb and Jen later. But what's been great about the responses of community futures, both in the Caribou region with the fires and Grand Forks after the floods, is that they had rapid deployment of small loans to help people, start to meet some basic needs with their businesses. And they also had the ambassador program, where they had people who are providing direct technical assistance to businesses. And these are now, pre-packaged. These can go immediately and be deployed anytime there's a disruption. And this is something that all of our CFs can be involved in and can be replicated throughout the province. But we need coordination between CFs and the local communities to actually bring that on as soon as possible. Buy local campaigns, I think, are always a really important necessity after a disaster. After Joplin, the Joplin tornado, which tore through the downtown, we had an immediate, response by the mayor and chamber that said, hey, shop Joplin, we're open for business. Anybody who is open, we're going to promote them continually. They created these giant green signs because it was hard to tell who is closed and who is open because everyone had damage. So they put these big green signs in the front yards of anybody who was open. And, much against the trends where usually, anywhere from 50 to 80% of businesses go out of business within the first 2 years, they had 80% of their businesses reopen. But then they also had 250 new businesses open. They actually had a net economic gain after the disaster. And it's not solely because of the Buy Local campaign. There were other regulatory approaches that they took with the rebuilding, but it was a significant part. It really focused the community on, you've got to keep your money local and keep investing into these businesses so that we can keep them. In Fort McMurray, what was great was that they had a hotline that they immediately started. And they basically started calling any business on the business license list. And then they promoted the phone number out so that anybody else who needed access to services could call in. And what this allowed was like a constant stream of communication to small business. What I found in working recoveries is that very few communities yet, it's increasing now, but for a long time, few communities ever had centralized communication for businesses. They had lots of call-in numbers for residents, but they didn't have that one place where someone could call in and say, I have this need, how can I meet it? I'm trying to figure out what's happening now with the grants, program, or what's happening with the licensing program. And so having that centralized source is really important. But one thing that this also pointed out was that, they realized that, 2,355 companies were on the business license list in their database, but 43% of the businesses that they interacted with did not have a current license. This is especially true in communities that are outside of incorporated areas, like in British Columbia, where a lot of those businesses aren't required to have licenses if they're in the regional districts. And so, this is something to also keep in mind, that, it's great to have a hotline, it's great to have this proactive communication tool, but also it's good to know who your businesses are. Like, who are they? What are their names? How can you get in touch with them? This is some good information gathering that we should consider more and more. And then finally, with Santa Rosa, California, with the wildfire, one of the big things that they ran into is that just across the board, they had a huge onslaught of permit applications. As you can see in that giant, bucketed area, there were all of these requests for rebuilding that came with permits and architectural drawings and the whole thing. But they only had like a few planners on staff. They didn't have, a whole cadre of planners to go through all this stuff. And so what they did is they reached out to the state and national network of planners and said, hey, does anybody want to come to town and work on some of these permitting applications? And the fact is that a lot of people in those networks, they want to do that. They want to do something philanthropic, participate in the recovery. And so they had a bunch of planners that said, yeah, I'll come down to Santa Rosa for the weekend. And over that weekend, they banged out 100 projects. They were able to review those and get them situated for permitting. And, so I think there's a couple stories here, but one is definitely, have we identified what the provincial and national networks are? Can we already get relationships in place that say, hey, if we have something happen, can we reach out to you and have planners or have other sorts of technical expertise type people come out and participate in our recovery? So just shifting gears into the last section now, I just want to talk a little bit about the planning needs and some of the things that we should be thinking about. And this is really what we're going to be speaking to when we get into these sessions over the next couple of weeks. And the first thing is, who are the businesses and workers most critical to our basic needs and livelihoods? I think even if you have a business list, you might not always know, well, what are the really important businesses on that list that we need to return? The obvious ones are the grocery stores, the major employers, daycares, and pharmacies, the trades organizations, et cetera. But, one that I always like to bring up is like the dollar store. They have a lot of people who are, in vulnerable populations who depend on dollar stores, not only for cheap goods and services, but also for food. There's a lot of prepackaged food that gets sold through those stores, and they're sold very cheaply. Now, obviously there are health concerns about living a lifetime on that food, but that's a product of poverty and a larger question. But from our perspective, have we actually accounted for those types of stores in our economic resilience strategy? Are we doing the kinds of things that enable those types of stores to come back as well? And so being able to bring those ideas to the table is important in our planning process. One way to get at this is through community asset mapping. One of the things that we're doing in this process is we're not doing a community engagement per se, but we are doing a survey with each community to try to map out, well, who are the important businesses in your community? What are the important stores that deliver goods and services to everybody, but also to vulnerable populations? What are the cultural businesses that are important? Is there like this core barbershop where the old folks, go to and it's important to them and you want them to come back because there's social capital in those places. There's a lot more that happens than just hair cutting. It's people finding out information. It's people saying, oh, could I borrow $20? There's a lot of importance to those places. So being able to map out and understand, who is important in the economy is part of your strategy. The second aspect of this is who are the businesses and workers most vulnerable to disruption. I often show this slide and say, usually as cities, we look at something like this and we just look at a floodplain map. We're like, okay, well, here's our downtown corridor. We know that the 100-year floodplain is 5 feet. So these businesses will be impacted and these others won't. But the fact is that even though all of these businesses might have the same risk to a flood, they have very different vulnerabilities. So some businesses will have great insurance, great capacity. They'll have lots of connections socially, and others won't. And so it's really important to not only understand, well, what's the risk profile for your downtown core, but also what's the vulnerability profile, like who is actually prepared to deal with these things. So one of the things we have to talk about is, well, how can you understand your community and do it in a low cost way? There are lots of partnerships that you can have with your local universities, your chambers of commerce, your business publications locally. There are oftentimes already, initiatives ongoing where there are surveys happening with your citizens or business community, where you could just continue to pop in little questions here and there, or create student projects with the local college, or get onto your business website some survey questions and find out, well, who has insurance, who has business interruption insurance, who has a business continuity plan, how are people prepared to get their employees back, where would they relocate if they had to change their business location immediately. Being able to understand all that is important, and there are low-cost ways of doing that. You don't have to bring in a consultant for $100,000. You can just partner locally with these stakeholders and have them, dig up that information for you. The next issue is, how are economic development emergency management plans supporting economic resilience? The answer is usually not very much. When we look at plans, and I do this a lot, not because I particularly enjoy plans that much, but I think it's a really great insight into communities, is, looking at an economic development plan, emergency management plan, official community plan, and saying, well, where are people talking about economic resilience? Even in plans that are for the economy, there's usually not much. People are mostly talking about, well, how are we, what's our 10-year growth strategy? How are we attracting high tech? We're not saying, well, how do we actually get, the grocery store back open? I did a project in Colorado after the 2013 floods. We went to 25 communities and looked at their economic development plans and scored them. Right, our Selkirk team is doing exactly that for our communities in the Kootenays, and thank you, Selkirk, we love you. But what we found in Colorado was that these blue bars that you see, those are what's not observed. And we created a list of best practices across all these categories, looking at governance and business continuity and risk management and diversification and communication systems. There was hardly anything. And the things that we did find, we mostly gave partial credit for. If they even mentioned the workforce, we said, okay, well, this is something you can build on to think about workforce return, and what's the program that you have for this. Overall, found that it's not in the plans. And then when we talked to people offline and said, well, do you have informal arrangements that's not in your plans? They usually didn't have those either. So really we need our plans to kind of catch up with this, because this is not something that's just once in 100 years we might have to deal with. Going back to the first slide, it's becoming more and more common, and we really do need these in place. The next thing is just how can we repurpose what we have in order to reduce costs and time? My message continually is let's make this cheap. Let's do what, let's build on what we already have. Many communities already have a roundtable or a task force that they can sort of commandeer and say, hey, you're already working on our resort strategy. Can you also start talking a little bit about resilience? There's no need to necessarily build a new infrastructure within your community to focus on this. Do you have call centers and info guides that you can repurpose and use for resilience when there is a disaster? Do you have sister city and corporate MOUs? Do you already have a procurement relationship with a provider where you can say, hey, in addition to what you normally do, can you have 20 generators on site immediately after a disaster for us, so that we can deploy them in our downtown and have the businesses that have especially food, refrigerators and stuff, automatically have access to some generators. The list goes on, but the point is that you've got a lot of existing capacity that you only have to sort of tilt a little bit and focus on these issues. You don't have to necessarily invest millions of dollars in sort of rejigging your city or your region to resilience.
Jeremy, could you
Oh, yeah.
speak a bit to, I'm just looking at the chat box here,
Mhm.
just a comment about regional agreements, and if one of the three cities that we're working on right now were affected by a natural disaster, what the role of a neighboring community could be?
Yeah, I mean, I think regional support is important, and my sneaky goal, and I think Andrea, it is yours as well, is that once we get through this planning process with the 8 communities, then we'll actually be able to have regional networks of communities with plans who can speak to each other and say, okay, well, here's the 10 gaps in our plan. Here's the 10 gaps in your plan. How can we actually support each other in this? How can we help each other with communications or help each other with business space, et cetera? I definitely think, again, that you shouldn't be doing this alone. It's a whole community approach, and it's a whole communities approach where multiple, areas are supporting each other. We see that often in other disasters. One random example is that in the Texas Gulf Coast, where I'm originally from, we have a lot of oil spills, and there's a lot of sister city agreements for use of ATVs. For some reason, some communities without ATVs really want them to go out there and ride along the beach and look for tar balls. And so they have those relationships in place that something goes down and another community brings over all their ATVs and they can do that work. So there's and there's a lot of goodwill between communities already that you can build off of. Cool. So, one case example I love giving is Tara Stroop from Port Coquitlam. She's an emergency manager there who just realized that they weren't doing enough about recovery, and they certainly weren't planned for business recovery. And she started doing this work off the side of her desk, started, doing some surveys locally and finding out what the needs were from businesses. She employed some of her ESS volunteers, and I mean employ like just she got them to volunteer on this. But her emergency social service volunteers were already very keen. They wanted to be involved, and so when she gave them something new to think about, of like, well, how are businesses being supported? They did a lot of free work and were able to get the business community together. Now she has regular workshops for the businesses that are funded because of all the work that she's done. She's been able to track that funding. They were able to get some funding to do this emergency preparedness toolkit for businesses. And now she's getting recognized by UBCM and others as a leader in this field. And none of this was like a big contract sort of approach. This was just a very small incremental approach that she did just, again, as something, part of a passion project within her job description. So, I think that these approaches are possible. We just have to, create that room for people like her to succeed. And then finally, how can we empower and connect to each entity that holds a piece of economic resilience? Again, I've been repeating this throughout the conversation or the monologue, sorry. But, it's not just about government and business and emergency management. There are lots of different people that hold different pieces of this. The colleges and universities can support, TA providers can support, chambers can support, residents can support. One of the things I often point out are just nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits and even for-profit, but social service-oriented for-profits like senior centers and retirement homes, et cetera. They all have little pieces of this. They are connected to the LGBT community or to the seniors community or the youth community, and within each of those communities are entrepreneurs. There are businesses that serve those communities. And so, the nonprofits can be your case managers immediately after a disaster. They can be the conduits through which you push preparation and business continuity trainings and planning. There's a lot of work that can be done with those types of organizations. And so they should be at the table as well. Getting to what we're doing now, and we'll sort of end it off here, is that we are embarking on this, planning approach where we're, doing some of the stuff that I've already mentioned, the asset mapping and the evaluation of the plans. And then we're going to be supporting communities to put together their own economic resilience plans. One of the things that I want to point out to all of you, as we get to this process, is that number one, we're going to be breaking, like when we have the engagement sessions, we'll be breaking into groups and looking at each of these aspects of economic recovery and resilience. You know, who will be doing the economic impact assessment immediately after a disaster? Who will be in charge of writing the plans? Who will be involved in communications? There's a ton of stuff that we have to be thinking about, and we don't have to have it all figured out right now. This is not like we're going to sit down and in one day completely figure out, you know, everything, and then you can walk away and say, okay, that's settled. But I think it's important to ask, well, who would do the assessment? Well, you know, here's who we think would do that. You know, we're going to spend the next, you know, 6 months, a year communicating with local colleges, with, you know, our local consultants who live in the community, anyone, and figure out who could take on that work. And then, you know, make the list of, well, who owns this piece? Who owns the economic impact assessment piece? How do they deploy all that work after a disaster, and then report back to the group? And so we'll, you know, go through and sort of prepare the skeletal structure for those, and then we'll put together this sort of mitigation preparedness strategy. We'll say, okay, well, you know, over the next, you know, 12 months, how are we going to do the capacity building and training? What's our timelines for this plan? How are we going to exercise the plan and then update the plan in the future? You know, I want to really emphasize that resilience is iterative. You know, you don't have to do it all in one day, and every step you take towards it, you're just improving your resilience more and more. It is cumulative. So, you know, I think from the outset, a lot of people look at this and they're like, oh my God, like, how are we going to do all that? You know, this is overwhelming. I don't think it has to be overwhelming. If you get the right people in the room and everybody says, okay, I see who could start thinking about this and who can be a champion of this, then you can just start working on it over time and with whatever resources you have, and incrementally get better and better. But you want to have this structure. You know, you want to actually be able to say, okay, well, here's the universe of things that we need to think about, and here's what we're working on. And hopefully over time you get more confident that, you know, we're in the right place, and we have the resources aligned so that when something does go wrong, we've got something we can refer to. We can pull out the assessment section and immediately say, okay, you know, so-and-so is going to do this, and we're going to deploy these students there. They're going to find out, you know, who's got damage and who doesn't, and we'll be ready to go. So this is my info. If any of you want to contact me, you know, get more information, freak out, whatever, I'm totally happy to be your support person for stuff like that. And I'm just really looking forward to meeting all of you and spending time in the community with our Selkirk students and, you know, doing this work. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great overview, and hopefully people are feeling more up to speed now on when we talk about economic resilience and recovery, specifically what we're talking about getting together in terms of a plan. I think for me, some of the things that stand out for me that I'm excited to get a bit of a plan in place for our communities for are things like controlling the story. So, you know, having identified ahead of time who is going to be putting information out to the media about what is going on in our community, that we do in fact have businesses open. So I think that's a really key piece, and something with a little bit of advanced planning that we could do a really good job of. The other one is keeping the business local. So as opposed to having external suppliers come in and take business away from our community, if we have local suppliers that can take that work on, let's make sure we're giving our local suppliers that business. And the other thing that I really like is looking for the silver lining to these kinds of incidents taking place. So if with our recovery effort, we're thinking about our economic development goals and priorities and building them into our recovery effort, there's an opportunity there as well. So that's something I'm looking forward to in terms of this planning process. Before we go to my Community Futures colleagues, I just wanted to ask if people had questions for Jeremy. You're welcome to type them in the chat or unmute your microphone and speak up.
Hey Jeremy, it's Diana Nilsson, Kootenay Lake Tourism.
Hi, Diana.
Hi. I was just wondering what kind of knowledge you have regarding the tourism agency playing a role in stuff like this. And if we do play a role, you know,
Yes.
How much of a role do we play?
Well, I mean, as much as you have the capacity to, but I definitely think that, there's a huge role that could be played by tourism agencies in terms of supporting the brand rehabilitation for the area. So, a lot of times, that brand damage that I spoke of earlier, there's not necessarily the communications savvy or the messaging that people are ready for immediately when this happens. So having, a highly motivated tourism agency to do that is important. At least from a support perspective, and being able to outline, well, here's how we can recast, rebrand, support. But I also think that there are a lot of local businesses that need to be highlighted, and your tourism operations are generally already, promoting businesses and trying to get people when they come to town to actually participate in experiences, participate in, purchasing from certain businesses. And so once you have, say, like the economic assessment team go out and find out who's open and who's not, then they can provide you with those lists back. And then you can do that job of promoting those businesses that are open and weaving the stories and putting together the experiences that promote them in the short term.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, cool.
I guess there has to be part of the communications plan then has to include the tourism organization so that we are working with them, not just at the later date relaying what they've already put together. Because we do have the expertise in the marketing aspect of it. We have all the tools and the resources to help there.
Yeah. And I would just say that, I think that part of this in terms of breaking all of these functions into sections in the economic resilience plan is to have not only some champions who sort of work on each of these things, but then also having the network of those champions come together. So hopefully you would be at the table in whatever situation that you're looking at, so that you're participating alongside with all these folks and you're all on the same page of how to coordinate.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thanks, Diana. Good question. Other questions at this point in time? Okay, well, I'm going to introduce my colleagues, and if you do have more questions for Jeremy, hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end. So I'm going to ask Deb and Jennifer to turn on their cameras.
Andrea, it's Jennifer. I just upgraded my desktop, and for some reason my camera isn't working.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on. I'm kind of frantically trying to figure it out here, but I am here and I'm waving right now.
Okay, sounds good. And Deb, what about you?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there we are. Awesome. Okay. Awesome. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues. So Deb Arnaud is the General Manager of Community Futures Sun Country based in Ashcroft. And also online, we have Jennifer Wetmore, who's with Community Futures Boundary based in Grand Forks. And I asked them to join us for this webinar today because they've both recently been through experiences where they were put in a position of supporting their community with economic recovery. So I thought it would be valuable to have them share a little bit in terms of their experience. And if they had the opportunity to have planned, what were some of the things they would have liked to have done, or what would have been some of the benefits of that? So I'm going to ask Deborah and Jennifer, I'm going to just kind of throw a question at you and then have you alternate back and forth with answering them. And Deb, we'll start with you if that's okay. So can you tell us just briefly about the natural disaster that occurred in your region?
Well, with regards to natural disaster, we had the flooding in 2017 in April, and anybody that's been through our area, we're semi-desert, so this was unprecedented to have this incredible flood. It was absolutely horrific. We actually lost our fire chief at that flood. We had about 6 weeks after losing our fire chief and having the ceremonies, the wildfires. He hadn't even had a chance to even really recover with the flooding in Cache Creek and the region. The wildfire hit, we were all gone again for a few weeks. I live just north of Cache Creek, so I was evacuated for about 2 months. We were thinking we were kind of getting back on track, and then anybody that understands with wildfires, we then were hit with the flooding in 2018 and landslides, and once again we had a horrific incident where we lost an individual in the slide when her and her husband had pulled over to put the top of their convertible up, and the slide came down and took her away. So, it's interesting. I was listening to somebody that was in tourism there. So we didn't have any wildfires this year, but once again, we had the slides. Once again, there was situations where I couldn't get home from work because I work in Ashcroft, live north of Cache Creek. So once again, our lives are disrupted. Our businesses are disrupted because they shut down all the highways to the point now that they have the signs up there, if it's raining, do not stop. So now we're having visitors just drive through the area. So that's kind of where we're at.
Thanks for that context, Deb. Jennifer, can you speak to last summer in Grand Forks?
I sure can, yeah. And apologies about my camera. I don't know what's going on. I should have come in a bit earlier. So on May 10th, 2018, Grand Forks and the Boundary region as a whole experienced what is considered to be at this stage in the game the worst flooding event in BC's recent history. We still don't know if it was a 1 in 200 year flood or more than that. We're waiting for more satellite imagery and engineering, et cetera. At the end of the freshet, which went on for about 5 days, and then there was an expected another few days where we anticipated another hit that actually, thank goodness, didn't come. There was over 400 kilometers of riverfront impacted, significantly impacted in the region as a whole. So from Big White through to Christina Lake. We had over 400 homes and 150 businesses severely damaged. Estimates ranging from $26 to $30 million of immediate impact, with projected losses moving forward of about another 10 million. So we have been in negotiation with the province for some period now around a buyout of a neighborhood, which has been incredibly challenging for this community. And a bunch of other related pieces that come with an event of that caliber, of that scope. And here we are another year and a half later, still trying to wrap our mind around impacts on tourism, impacts on business, etc. So,
thanks, Jennifer. So in terms of thinking about economic resilience and recovery planning, the communities we're going to be working with have the luxury of trying to get ourselves prepared to mitigate the impact. Through your experience, and Deb, I'll start with you again, can you tell us what roles and responsibility do you wish had been identified ahead of a natural disaster occurring?
Well, first of all, I want to say kudos to your region for getting ahead of the game and doing the planning, because I need to tell you, in our region, we are reacting to everything. We haven't had a real chance to plan. And yes, we've got the best intentions to sit around and talk about that. But in my experience, one of the things that I found very, very challenging at the very beginning, and keep in mind, I'm focusing on the business aspect, was the lack of communication, trying to find out what was going on, trying to even connect with the businesses and the leadership. Yeah, I think that looking back now, it would have been great if the leaders could all have got together and shared some kind of a communication strategy, because it was fragmented and we did not even know where to look anymore, whether it be Facebook, the radio. Apparently there was some stuff happening on TV, but we were lost. Like, no one really knew as to what direction to go. So that was the gap that I noticed living through this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for sharing that. Jennifer, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I'm just kind of making notes while Deb's speaking because there's so much overlap. Again, kudos to all of you for the planning process. We too are reacting. However, having said that, we've learned an immense amount through this event. What I would have loved to have in place was an understanding of who the community-led recovery team would be. And in a perfect world, the reassurance that that team would be very well resourced, both from a funding perspective and from a support perspective at the provincial and federal level. It would have made such an immense difference. And again, I'm coming at this from the business perspective as well. What I would have liked to have a lens on was exactly what was going on in the EOC. So there was, in our case, an EOC that was active for, I'm going to say, 3 weeks. There was no representation for either bigger industry and or business in that EOC. And what happened was there was no clear entry and or exit plan for businesses. They didn't receive evacuation notices because most of them were out sandbagging their homes or their friends' homes or their parents' homes. No single credible source of information, Deb, as you've said. There was nowhere really for us to know where to go. No hub location outside of the downtown core. So we had continuity plans, but most of those continuity plans were for a relocation to an adjoining business in the downtown core, all of which was evacuated and not available. So we had businesses scrambling to get back in the game shortly after the event, but no location to do it. So those are just a few of the pieces that I think had we had in place early on would have made a big difference.
Okay, thanks for that, Jennifer. This is a big question, Deb, but I'll ask you to maybe just speak to what stands out for you. So in terms of the economic recovery effort, what went well and what mistakes were made?
Wow. With regards to, I think, what went well with regards to business, I think part of it was the participation of the community futures offices that we got together. I think if we're going to look at kind of recovery, and I know that Jeremy touched on this, you really need to think regionally. Each community cannot think of, on their own and try to figure it out because we don't have all the expertise in each of the communities. So I think what worked well for us is right away as community futures, we pulled together and we went regionally and said, what do we need to do? And kind of giving everybody an idea. We've got 82 communities we're working with. So this is a huge, huge undertaking. So what we did was we kind of stepped forward and said, okay, this is what we need to do with business, and started communicating with businesses one-on-one right away. And I think what I know really helped us was the business ambassadors reaching out, because businesses felt they were alone, they were not being heard, they didn't even know where to go to communicate. Once again, getting back to that communication, I really think there needs to be a strategy for businesses on communication and where they can tap into and get that support. I think the mistakes made, once again, I'm going to go with not recognizing that communities really need to support their businesses. I heard Jeremy speak earlier about, getting them, getting them revved up again, bringing them back to business. In many of our communities, we had people that were coming in from outside the area, doing a lot of the work, and I'm like, whoa, what the hell's going on here? We've got our own businesses that have not had any revenue for months and months. What the hell is going on? And anybody that knows me, I do not have much of a filter, because I think I'm past that after a couple of years now. And it's like, okay, we're here for business. Let's get the business up and going. We need to see some revenue happening here. So I think that some of the mistakes made was possibly those that aren't involved in business to understand how critical business needs to be up and running immediately to provide us the services that we need to live in our communities.
Thanks, Deb. Jennifer, from your perspective.
Yeah, and just echoing Deb's last point before I forget it, the real challenge around the cultural aversion of the provincial and federal government to assist in supporting business is a significant challenge. And I think it's a real challenge, and I don't know that it's going to go away anytime soon. But I think when you're thinking about resilience planning, you need to understand that, and you need to manage expectations. So, again, what was challenging for us, I'm going to start there, was really understanding what the challenges were. We hadn't done any thinking about this in advance of this event. So I'm gonna list off a few: insurance, disaster financial assistance, business continuity. I think were the top three challenges, both from an understanding of exactly what the intricacies of those are and were going to be, and from a mitigation perspective. We had no idea when disaster financial assistance came into our community that the support level for business would be as abysmal as it was. The expectation from the business community was that they were going to be there for them, and they were not, because the legislation does not allow them to be. The same with insurance. Had our businesses spent time digging into their insurance, understanding what they were insured for, it would have been a very different world here in the Boundary region. They did not. I'm going to flag that for your resilience planning. We had no idea how to help them manage that. And I think the last piece was we really didn't understand what support was going to be available from the provincial, federal, or even local government level per business. And again, you know, simple things like ripping out drywall out of your business and piling it up on the sidewalk. There are significant costs associated with getting rid of debris post an event like this. There was no support, you know, immediately following the event for businesses. There was for residents, and we had to lobby and go to bat for all of that stuff. So those were the big challenges right off the top of my head. I think what was done well in our particular case, and the same as Deb's, was I'm calling it an all-encompassing community-led support approach for business. This was our organization in partnership with Chamber, DBA, and other local entities going out and talking to our businesses, supporting our businesses as best we could. It was ad hoc. We fumbled a lot, but we were the people in the community taking charge. That worked really well for us. It was challenging, as Deb has said, I think quite nicely, that it is really difficult when you have other entities coming into your community and layering and duplicating and taking what I consider to be at times a shotgun approach to support this. It's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Jennifer. And I should mention, there's two angles we're approaching this with. One is by providing specific training to individual businesses in developing their own business continuity plans. So just so the folks on the webinar are aware, through Community Future Central Kootenay, we have a workshop businesses can take to help get their own continuity plans in place. The purpose of this economic resilience planning is to look at it from more of a community lens, but both of those pieces are essential. So thanks for bringing that up, Jennifer. So a next step for us in terms of this plan development process is, after this webinar today, we're going to be sending a survey out to the stakeholders on the webinar and who are going to be at our community planning workshops to start developing a list of assets we have in the community that we may want to draw from as part of our plan. So it could be things like physical spaces, volunteer networks, existing organizations. So I'd be interested to hear from you, what were assets in your community that you drew upon with your recovery effort?
Well, Andrea, I'm going to be brutally honest. I think the challenge for our region was because we were all evacuated.
Right.
And I think, so we were all over the place and everybody was spread out. You know, I was contacting my colleagues because, once again, I was thinking of the businesses. And the reason I was thinking so much of them was because I was the ESS in lineup with them, and they were freaking out. Because keep in mind, businesses are also concerned about their home and their personal livelihood. And now they've also got their business that they're saying, holy crap, what am I going to do, Deb? If I lose that, I've lost not only my livelihood, but I'm my home, like where are we going to go? All of those kind of things. So one of the things that I need to recognize is BC EDA and Fortis, because when all this was going on, they developed the hotline. That hotline was critical for myself as someone that is providing support to small business, because I was living in my trailer. However, what was happening at the hotline, the businesses were calling into the hotline. They were then deploying it out to CF offices. Then those managers were getting a hold of me because they would look at the area and say, okay, Deb, this is one of your clients and this is what they need to know. So then I was able to communicate with these businesses, because really, I mean, they didn't have my cell number, and there was a toll-free number. So also I knew that I had some specialists in the Community Futures offices that understood who we are, what we needed to do. So they were able to deal with some questions very quickly, or say, you know what, I'm going to follow up with the manager and get right back to you. So at least the businesses felt like somebody was hearing them, providing them the support that they needed at the time, because, you know, there really wasn't any physical location, because it was so huge. There was 65,000 of us spread everywhere. So to think of a location was, to be honest, the last thing on our list at that time.
Right.
But I think going forward, I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and really, you know, you never know what the disaster you're faced with is going to be. But that's a good example that it's not just local resources, but our partners and external resources that we might be able to draw from as well.
And if I could just add something there, you know, one of the things that I've found in working recoveries is that there's just a ton of rumors. You know, there's a lot of conversation that's happening, and a lot of it is very well intentioned, but you'll have, say, the Chamber of Commerce saying one thing, and then the workforce organization saying a thing, and the business organizations all saying things, the bank saying something, and people are just hearing things and then redistributing that information. Some of it's correct. A lot of it is, you know, sort of gray or completely false. And so, you know, the great thing about having like a business emergency operations center is that you've got like a centralized, you know, group of people who are taking in all the information, vetting it, figuring it out. And then when you have the hotlines, or you have like something online where you're dispersing information, then there's like one, you know, singular voice. And if you can get all the other people, like the chambers and the banks and the TA organizations, all focusing people back into the hotline or back into that online portal, then everybody's getting hopefully, you know, more consistent information that's correct. It's vital, I find, because people get really scared and they start hearing rumors, and then they start making decisions like, oh, well, crap, I'm going to go buy this, or I'm going to go do that, because they've been prompted.
Right. Thanks for that, Jeremy. Jennifer, over to you. Any examples of assets that your community drew from?
Yeah, and again, our event was, you know, I mean, big in scope, but more localized than what Deb was dealing with, or has been dealing with for some time. So what we saw happen in our community was actually really, really impressive. There was no business emergency operations center. Really, that was us at the end of the day. It was an impromptu kind of thing. Some of the assets that were surprising, I think, when I look back on it, was GoFundMe accounts, which were incredibly quick in landing on the ground here in our community and actually getting money out to businesses. I've said this before, they were the first GoFundMe accounts, got $100 to 80 businesses out the door within 3 or 4 days of this event. We managed that for him, because he didn't have a process. Of course, we had to throw together a committee, and you know, there was due diligence. I always think that was a huge success for us. The faith community, the church community, was a huge player in this event. They drove volunteer drives. They reached out to surrounding community, whether it was Trail or Castlegar, to solicit support through a bunch of different channels. They provided space for community meetings, as did the school district, another huge player in helping us move forward. Chamber organization spent a lot of time in my office, as did the Downtown Business Association. We had two times a week meetings with the provincial staff who were involved in our event, and talked and strategized about tourism reentry and various other things. They were a big, big player. Rotary Club was also another huge asset. They provided support through fundraising, as did our grocery stores. I mean, they, you know, when they were back up and running, they provided a huge amount of support to people who were evacuated and you know, sleeping in the curling rink, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that list, Jennifer.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just to update the group. So in terms of next steps, following this webinar, I will be sending out that asset mapping survey. We're asking you to complete it by November the 18th. Feel free to share it with people in your network that you think fit the description of of the organizations represented that Jeremy pointed out. And then that information will be compiled by the Selkirk College students that are supporting us, and will be brought to our face-to-face workshops that we're going to be doing in Castlegar, Nelson, and Slocan Village. Any questions for Deb or Jennifer from our group? I'm not seeing any bubble up. Deb, any last words of advice for us as we move forward with developing this plan?
Like I said, good for you, because everybody's been talking about it, but nobody's really actioning on a lot of this stuff. So well done. I think having Jeremy involved is tremendous. Like, Jeremy's got a wealth of information. I got to tell you, I've learned so much from you, Jeremy. And so, yeah, no, I just think it's amazing, and I need to tell you, I'm going to be keeping track, because I'm thinking that you may have the model that could be used for the rest of the province, Andrea, because I don't see anybody else moving forward like this. So well done, and good luck with this.
Thank you. Jennifer, advice from your end?
No, just echoing Deb's comment about Jeremy. He is outstanding. He's got a ton of information to offer and support, as do your neighbors here, you know, over the hump. We are here for you. Anything that you need, we're more than happy to share our lessons learned, and anytime, any place, any of you can reach out to us.
Thanks for that. And I really would like to thank Deb and Jennifer. They've been really vocal about sharing their experience and what the impact has been on their community, which has really put it on the radar of communities around the province in terms of what could happen and what we should be doing to try to prevent that. So thank you guys for sharing your information. And you've been great resources for all of us. So thank you. Anything final, Jeremy, that we want to share with the group, or any final questions? If you haven't RSVP'd already for your community session, please do so. You can do that by emailing me or by accepting the meeting request that I would have sent out. If there's key people in your community that you think should be invited to be a part of this process, feel free to connect them with me. We've done our best to put together a well-rounded list of stakeholders, but I think we could always there's always going to be people out there that we might not be aware of that we'd like to have at the table. And other than that, we will look forward to seeing you in person towards the end of November or the first week of December. I will be sending out a recording of this for the people that weren't able to be on the call today. So again, if you have colleagues that you think would benefit from seeing it, please share it with them. And thank you for all of your time. And thanks to our guests, Jeremy, Jennifer, and Deb.
You're very welcome, and good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Andrea, I know you've jumped in there and just made one final call for a question. So aside from the salutations, I would like to ask maybe two things.
Sure, yeah.
Will we have an opportunity to put this in a more public place, like a YouTube channel or a Community Futures website, or somewhere where the community can see these slides and go through them? I think there's a lot of good stuff here, and bringing everyone together in one time and place is good, and maybe being selective is good, but I think at some point having a library or a catalog that people can dip into and realize there's some depth and there's some more that they want to learn, I think would be helpful. I'm just wondering if you'll be publishing this in a more public way.
Yeah, good question, Keith, and I'll need to check in with Deb and Jennifer and Jeremy. But Selkirk College had made that request, as well as, you know, one of the organizations that has flowed funding into this project. They'd like to include it in their resources. So I think if we do house it somewhere, it would be on the Selkirk College website through their Rural Development Institute.
I guess my second question is more towards Jeremy. As we look at going forward with this and kind of picking up on Deb's component, the transparency of whether a business is ready to be, is resilience ready or not, is not something that, you know, in our culture or business cultures, we really have a mechanism of communicating in the community that, you know, this business is ready, it's got the proper insurance, it's done the planning, it's going to bounce back quickly. You mentioned the community down in the States that was hit by the tornado had done, like, we're open for business. But before that happens, have you seen any kind of branding exercises, or communities have done a very good job of kind of being very open about which businesses, like maybe in terms of community report card, or in terms of a little bit of a combination with the Chamber of Commerce and some sort of decal, like that's been renewed every once in a while? Has there been anything that kind of helps the community see which businesses have gone through this work and are in a good position and which ones haven't, to try and create a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses scenario with each other?
I really haven't seen too much being done on it, and honestly, I don't know how much value there is, just because it's hard to get businesses to actually care about this in the first place because they're worried about so many other issues. You know, they're just trying to make payroll and stuff like that. But then also, you know, business continuity is not necessarily a very, you know, interesting thing. You know, it's not bringing in extra revenue usually. There's not a lot that will incentivize businesses to say like, oh, well, I care about that decal on my, or sorry, I'm American, so I still say decal instead of decal. But you know, they don't necessarily have the draw to want to participate like that. But you know, my advice has always been, well, can we connect this to services? So, you know, increasingly communities are talking about, well, if you're going to get a business license, you know, especially smaller communities are able to do this. If you're going to get a business license, you have to show some sort of evidence that you've, you know, thought about this or gotten a business continuity plan. I know banks are sort of leading the way for that they're looking more and more, well, if our businesses are going to get financing from us, they have to show evidence of business continuity. With one example that I didn't put in this slide, but in this deck, but I talk about elsewhere is there's re-entry tiers that some communities do, so that say like Jefferson Parish in Louisiana, they've identified what business types they want to come back as soon as possible, and those businesses are allowed to get immediate re-entry to the city when, you know, after there's an evacuation. And so, you know, you can tie things to that, like, well, you have to have gone through a certification process or some sort of business continuity training so that you're ready for that. And then, you know, once you go through the process, you can get the early reentry or you can get business support, you know, at a faster rate. You know, I think that there's a lot that we're still trying to play with in different communities, but nothing that's been really substantial so far.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. If you are looking for more information on this topic, we did host a forum in the spring, and the presentations from that forum are posted on the Community Futures website. So it's at futures.bc.ca, and then on our homepage, if you look under Community Economic Development, you'll see a Community Economic Recovery section, which has more information about this as well. All right, thanks everyone. We'll please spend some time and energy filling out our survey that we're going to send out. And Jeremy and I will look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everybody.